The crystal formations on Zephys Prime hummed with a frequency that made Ambassador Keth's gill slits flutter nervously. She stood before the Grand Council's communication array, her blue-scaled hands trembling as she prepared to send what might be the last message her people would ever transmit. The hegemony had arrived 3 cycles ago. Their massive ships blotted out the twin suns of the Zephys system, casting shadows that seemed to drain the very life from the planets below. The peaceful trading worlds that had thrived for millennia were now burning. Keth's own homeworld of Aquatica had fallen just yesterday, its underwater cities reduced to rubble and steam. "The signal is ready, Ambassador," chirped Technician Errol from behind his console. The small, bird-like avian's feathers were ruffled with stress. His normally pristine plumage disheveled from days without proper grooming. "We've encoded it with every known frequency and translation protocol in the Galactic database." Keth nodded, her large eyes reflecting the blue glow of the transmission equipment. Around them, the emergency shelter buzzed with activity as representatives from dozens of species worked desperately to coordinate their defense. The gentle florals swayed their petal-like heads in distress, releasing spores that smelled of desperation. The crystalline lithoids rang out in harmonious frequencies that spoke of sorrow and fear. The hegemony was unlike anything the peaceful species of this sector had ever encountered. They were conquerors, pure and simple. They didn't negotiate, didn't seek trade agreements or cultural exchange. They simply arrived, announced their dominion, and began the systematic destruction of anyone who resisted. "Begin transmission," Keth commanded, her voice carrying the authority that had once made her one of the most respected diplomats in the sector. Now she was just another refugee hoping against hope that someone, somewhere, would hear their plea. The message was simple, broadcast on every frequency they could manage. "This is Ambassador Keth of the Zephys Sector Defense Coalition. We are under attack by an aggressive force known as the Hegemony. They have already destroyed 17 worlds and show no signs of stopping. We have no military capable of resistance. We are a peaceful alliance of trading species with no weapons of war. Please, if anyone receives this message, we desperately need help. We can offer payment in rare minerals, technological trade agreements, or anything else of value. Time is running out. Please help us." The transmission repeated continuously, sent out in all directions into the vast emptiness of space. Keth knew it was a long shot. The nearest military alliance was the Galactic Confederation, but they were 30 light-years away and had their own problems with border disputes. Other civilizations were either too far away or, like themselves, peaceful species with no real military capability. As the hours passed, responses began trickling in. The Botanical Collective sent their sympathies but explained that their ships were living creatures that couldn't survive in the vacuum of space long enough to reach Zephys. The Silicon Confederacy offered to accept refugees, but had no ships capable of making the journey in time. The responses were all the same, sympathy, but no real help. 3 days after the first transmission, long-range sensors detected another hegemony fleet approaching their last stronghold on Zephys Prime. The planet's defenders, if they could be called that, consisted of civilian cargo ships hastily fitted with mining lasers and construction equipment repurposed as weapons. Against the hegemony's warships, they would last perhaps minutes. That's when the first response came. Errol's feathers stood on end as his instruments detected something impossible. "Ambassador," he squawked, his voice cracking with disbelief. "I'm receiving a response to our distress call." Keth's heart-equivalent organ fluttered with sudden hope. "Put it through." The translation software worked overtime as an alien language unlike anything in their databases came through the speakers. The voice was rough, gravelly, with an undertone that made every creature in the shelter unconsciously step backward. Zephyr's Defense Coalition, this is Admiral Sarah Chen of the Terran Defense Force. We received your distress call. We're en route to your position. ETA 72 hours. Hold on. A stunned silence fell over the shelter. No one had ever heard of this Terran Defense Force. The name wasn't in any of their databases, but the most shocking thing was what their computers had detected about the transmission's origin point. Ambassador, Errol whispered, his voice barely audible. The transmission. It came from the Sol system. Gasps echoed throughout the shelter. Everyone knew about Sol. It was one of the forbidden zones, a star system marked in red on every galactic chart. The official designation was extreme hazard, no contact authorized. Most species taught their children about Sol as a cautionary tale, a system so dangerous that even the most adventurous explorers avoided it. The stories varied between species, but they all agreed on the basic facts. Sol was home to monsters. The dominant species there, called humans, were Deathworld predators of the worst kind. They came from a planet so hostile that it was considered uninhabitable by most galactic standards. High gravity, extreme weather, aggressive flora and fauna, and worst of all, they were pack hunters who had somehow developed intelligence. According to the few long-range observations that had been made, humans were carnivorous bipeds with forward-facing predator eyes, bone-crushing jaws filled with cutting teeth, and an apparent immunity to most toxins and diseases that would kill other species. They had developed weapons technology before achieving interstellar flight, itself a red flag for any civilized species. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to actually enjoy conflict and violence. The Galactic Survey had declared Sol off-limits nearly 2 centuries ago after a probe sent to study the system was somehow detected and destroyed by primitive chemical rockets. Since then, the system had been under strict quarantine. "They can't be serious," whispered botanist Vel, her flower-like head turning a sickly yellow color. Those creatures wouldn't help us. They'd probably join the hegemony in attacking us." But Keth found herself strangely hopeful. If even half the stories about humans were true, they might be exactly what the Coalition needed. The hegemony was a military force, but they had never faced anything like the legendary monsters of Sol. Another transmission came through that evening. This time, the voice was different, younger, more energetic, with that same underlying menace that seemed inherent to the human language. Zephyr's Coalition, this is Captain Marcus Rodriguez of the TDF Retribution. Our fleet is 2 days out. We've been monitoring hegemony communications. Looks like they've got quite the operation going here. Don't worry, folks. We've dealt with their type before. The casual confidence in the human's voice was almost more terrifying than reassuring. How could any species be so calm about facing the hegemony, the force that had torn through dozens of worlds like they were made of paper? More concerning were the reports coming from their long-range sensors. The approaching human fleet was massive, dozens of ships moving at speeds that shouldn't have been possible with any known propulsion technology. The ships themselves were unlike anything in the galactic databases. They were angular, aggressive-looking vessels that seemed designed for one purpose: war. As the hours ticked by, more species sent evacuation requests. The Crystalline Choir wanted to know if they could flee to another star system. The Aquatic Alliance was already loading their population ships. Even the normally steadfast Lithoid Council was making preparations to abandon their mining operations. But Keth found herself more curious than terrified. The humans' communications were brief and professional, but there was something in their tone that suggested they weren't just coming to help. They were coming to fight. And they sounded like they were looking forward to it. The night before the human fleet was due to arrive, Keth stood alone in the observation chamber, watching the stars through the transparent aluminum dome. In the distance, the lights of hegemony ships moved like predatory insects, slowly surrounding the planet. By tomorrow, the battle would begin. She thought about the message she had sent out into the void, desperate for anyone to answer their plea for help. She had never imagined that the response would come from humanity's forbidden star system. The galaxy's monsters were coming to save them. Whether that was salvation or simply a different kind of doom remained to be seen. As if responding to her thoughts, another transmission crackled through the speakers. This voice was different again, older, weighted with authority and something that might have been amusement. Zephys Coalition, this is Admiral Chen. We'll be dropping out of FTL in your system in 6 hours. Fair warning, things are about to get loud. Recommend you move all non-combatant vessels to the far side of your moon. Trust me on this one. The transmission cut off, leaving Keth alone with the approaching lights of 2 different fleets. Tomorrow, the galaxy's most feared species would face off against the sector's most destructive conquerors. For the first time in weeks, Keth all the human fleet arrived like a force of nature. Ambassador Keth watched through the observation dome as space itself seemed to tear open. The humans didn't use standard FTL exit procedures. Instead of the gentle dimensional shifts that most civilized species employed, they literally ripped holes in reality. Brilliant flashes of energy erupted across the system as dozens of ships materialized in formation, their arrival sending electromagnetic pulses racing across every sensor array on Zephys Prime. "Ancestors preserve us," breathed Technician Irel, his feathers now completely white with shock. "They're not slowing down." The human ships had emerged from FTL at combat speed, something that every known species considered suicidal. The gravitational stresses alone should have torn their vessels apart. But they held formation as if dropping out of hyperspace at maximum velocity was perfectly normal. Keth's gills fluttered as she studied the approaching fleet. The ships were even more intimidating up close than the long-range sensors had indicated. They were clearly built for war, no elegant curves or artistic flourishes that characterized most galactic vessels. These were angular, brutal-looking machines covered in weapon ports and armor plating. Even their smallest escorts were the size of Coalition battleships. "Incoming transmission," Irel announced, his voice barely a whisper. Admiral Chen's voice came through the speakers, and now Keth could hear something that chilled her to the core: anticipation. The human actually sounded excited. "Zephys Coalition, this is Admiral Chen. We've got eyes on the hegemony fleet." "Impressive numbers. Looks like they brought about 60 ships to the party. Should be fun." "Fun?" Keth exchanged glances with the other Coalition representatives. The hegemony fleet consisted of massive dreadnoughts, each one capable of glassing a planet. How could any species consider facing such odds fun? "We're going to need you folks to back off to minimum safe distance," Chen continued. "Things are about to get messy. Oh, and don't be alarmed by our tactics. We know what we're doing." On the tactical display, the human fleet was spreading out in a formation that made no sense to any Coalition strategist. Instead of forming a defensive line or massing their firepower, they were scattering across the system like they were planning to attack from every direction at once. The hegemony response was swift and predictable. Their commander, a massive creature called Warlord Krax, according to intercepted communications, sent a standard surrender demand to the human fleet. The translation matrix struggled with the hegemony's guttural language, but the message was clear: submit or be destroyed. The human response came not from Admiral Chen, but from the captain of the lead ship, the TDF Retribution. "Hegemony Fleet, this is Captain Rodriguez. Here's our counteroffer. Pack up your toys and get out of this system in the next 5 minutes, or we're going to show you why nobody messes with our neighbors." The casual arrogance in the human's voice sent ripples of shock through the Coalition shelter. Neighbors? Since when did humans consider anyone their neighbors? And the sheer audacity of threatening the hegemony. Warlord Krax's response was immediate and violent. The hegemony fleet opened fire with their planet-killer weapons, sending streams of energy that could melt continents racing toward the scattered human ships. What happened next would be talked about in military academies across the galaxy for centuries. The human ships didn't try to avoid the incoming fire. Instead, they accelerated straight into it. Energy beams that should have vaporized them struck some kind of shielding technology that absorbed the damage and somehow redirected it back at the attackers. But that wasn't the most shocking part. The humans were laughing. Their communication channels were open, and the Coalition could hear voices filled with what could only be described as joy as the human crews threw themselves into combat. They shouted encouragement to each other, made what sounded like jokes about the size of hegemony weapons, and generally acted like they were having the time of their lives. "Rodriguez, you seeing this?" came a voice over the radio. "These guys are shooting butterflies at us." "Copy that, Williams. Save some for the rest of us." "Admiral, requesting permission to ram that dreadnought," came another voice. "I've always wanted to try that." "Negative, Thompson. We talked about this. No ramming unless it's an emergency." "Aw, come on, Admiral. When's the next time we'll get to fight something this big?" Keth felt her knees give out as the implications hit her. These humans weren't just willing to fight the hegemony. They were enjoying it. The most feared military force in the sector was being treated like entertainment. The battle itself defied every law of space combat that the Coalition understood. Human ships moved in ways that should have been impossible, pulling maneuvers that would have turned most species into paste from the gravitational forces involved. They fought with a creativity and unpredictability that seemed to confuse the hegemony as much as their advanced technology. One human destroyer, the TDF Havoc, was surrounded by 3 hegemony cruisers. Instead of trying to escape, it fired cables at all 3 ships and used them to swing itself around like some kind of space-age gymnast, raking the enemy vessels with weapons fire as it spun. Another ship, the TDF Chaos Theory, somehow managed to convince the hegemony computer systems that it didn't exist, allowing it to fly through their formation completely undetected until it started shooting them from the inside. But the most terrifying display came from Admiral Chen's flagship, the TDF Terra's Wrath. The massive human dreadnought simply charged straight through the center of the hegemony fleet, its shields ablaze with absorbed energy. As it passed each enemy ship, it launched what appeared to be small pods. "What are those?" whispered botanist Vel, her petals trembling. The answer came when the first pod breached a hegemony hull. The enemy ship's lights flickered, then went out completely. Soon, internal explosions began ripping through its superstructure. "Boarding parties!" Keth said in horror. "They're sending their own people onto enemy ships." It was perhaps the most insane tactic any species had ever witnessed. In space combat, you destroyed enemy vessels from a safe distance. You didn't send your own crew onto them. The risk was astronomical, the chances of survival minimal. But the humans made it work. Their boarding parties, called Marines, according to their communications, moved through hegemony ships like a plague. The enemy vessels began surrendering or self-destructing rather than face capture. As the battle raged, more human transmissions leaked through to the Coalition receivers. What they heard defied belief. "Charlie Squad, we've got the bridge. These guys taste terrible, by the way." "Belay that, Rodriguez. We don't eat the prisoners." "Since when?" "Since Admiral Chen said so after the Proxima incident." "Oh, right. Well, they still smell awful." The casual mention of eating enemies sent shockwaves through the Coalition representatives. The humans weren't just fighters, they were predators in the most literal sense. Within 3 hours, it was over. The mighty hegemony fleet that had terrorized the sector for months was either destroyed, captured, or fleeing in disarray. The humans had suffered minimal casualties, a few damaged ships, and some wounded Marines who were reportedly complaining about missing the fun. As the last hegemony vessel jumped to FTL in retreat, Admiral Chen's voice came over the communication array one final time. Zephys Coalition, this is Admiral Chen. System is secure. Hegemony forces have been neutralized or driven off. We'll be conducting search and rescue operations for any survivors. Then we'd like to discuss establishing a permanent presence in the sector to prevent this from happening again. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The monsters from Seoul wanted to stay. But as Keth looked around at the faces of her fellow coalition members, the relief, the awe, the gratitude, she realized something important. Yes, the humans were terrifying. Yes, they were violent, predatory creatures who seemed to actually enjoy warfare. Yes, they probably could conquer the entire sector if they wanted to, but they had come when called. When every civilized species in the galaxy had offered sympathy but no help, the monsters from the Forbidden Star system had crossed dozens of light years to fight for people they had never met. "Admiral Chen," Keth said, her voice carrying across the communication array to the human fleet. "This is Ambassador Keth of the Coalition. We would very much like to discuss that permanent presence. And Admiral, thank you." The human's response carried what might have been warmth, though it was hard to tell through the alien vocal patterns. "Our pleasure, Ambassador. Someone's got to look out for the good guys. Chen out." As the human ships began forming patrol patterns around the system, Keth couldn't shake the feeling that the galaxy had just changed forever. The age of peaceful cooperation and civilized discussion might be over. The age of humanity had begun. Owed herself a small smile. Perhaps the monsters were exactly what they needed. 6 months after the Battle of Zephys Prime, Ambassador Keth found herself in a situation she never could have imagined, sitting across a negotiation table from a human. Admiral Sarah Chen was smaller than Keth had expected. The Coalition's databases had painted humans as towering predators, but the woman across from her barely reached chest height on most Coalition species. Her hair was gray-streaked, her face lined with what humans called wrinkles, and her eyes held a sharpness that spoke of decades of command decisions. What struck Keth most was how normal she seemed. During their video calls over the past months, Chen had been a voice and a grainy image on a screen. In person, she looked remarkably like any other sentient being trying to do a difficult job. "The patrol schedule is working well," Chen was saying, reviewing the holographic displays that showed human ships moving through Coalition space. "We've intercepted 2 more hegemony scouting expeditions and convinced a pirate fleet to find employment elsewhere. Your shipping lanes are the safest they've been in decades." Keth nodded, still adjusting to the way humans spoke so casually about violence. Convinced in human terminology usually meant shot at until they agreed to leave. Yet she couldn't argue with the results. Trade was flowing again, refugees were returning to rebuilt worlds, and for the first time in years, Coalition children could sleep without fear of invasion. "There is one matter we need to discuss," Keth said carefully. "The Galactic Senate has been asking questions about our arrangement with humanity." Chen's expression didn't change, but something in her posture suggested amusement. "Let me guess. They're worried that we're planning to conquer you." "The concern has been raised," Keth admitted. "Some species are suggesting that we've simply traded one threat for another." What Chen did next surprised Keth completely. The human admiral laughed, not the harsh, predatory sound Keth had expected, but something warm and genuinely amused. "Ambassador, can I tell you something about humanity that might not have made it into your databases?" Keth gestured for her to continue. "We've been spacefaring for over 2 centuries now. In that time, we've encountered 47 different intelligent species. Do you know how many we've conquered?" Keth waited, dreading the answer. 0. Chen leaned back in her chair. "Oh, we've fought plenty of wars, usually because someone attacked us first or was threatening someone we'd made friends with. But conquest, Building an empire? Ruling over other species? That's never been our way. But your reputation, the stories, are probably true, Chen said with another smile. We are predators. We are violent. We do come from a death world that would terrify most species. But here's what those stories miss. We're also pack hunters, and pack hunters protect their pack. Over the following weeks, Keth began to understand what Chen meant. The human fleet had indeed established a permanent presence in Coalition space, but not as conquerors. They had become guardians. Human patrol ships responded to every distress call, no matter how minor. When pirates attacked a floral merchant convoy, the TDF Retribution arrived within hours, its captain offering to escort the traders to their destination personally. When a plague broke out on an aquatic colony, human medical ships appeared with doctors who worked tirelessly alongside Coalition physicians. What shocked Keth most was discovering that humans weren't the mindless killers their reputation suggested. They were scientists, doctors, engineers, artists. The same species that had terrified the hegemony into retreat was sending teachers to Coalition schools and musicians to cultural exchanges. Dr. James Patterson, the human medical officer assigned to Zephys Prime, had become something of a celebrity among the aquatic population. His research into cross-species medicine had led to treatments for diseases that had plagued Coalition worlds for centuries. When Keth asked him how he felt about his species' reputation, he had simply shrugged. "We are what the galaxy needs us to be," he had said. "When threatened, we're warriors. When healing is needed, we're doctors. When knowledge is required, we're teachers. Adaptation is humanity's greatest strength." The truth was becoming clear to Keth and the rest of the Coalition leadership. Humans weren't monsters. They were protective. Incredibly, terrifyingly protective of anyone they considered part of their extended pack. This became evident when the crystalline choir made the mistake of testing human resolve. The silicon-based life forms had always been neutral in galactic conflicts, but they had grown nervous about human expansion into Coalition space. They sent a fleet to assess the situation, which in diplomatic terms meant they were rattling sabers. The human response was swift and educational. Admiral Chen personally led a small squadron to meet the crystalline fleet at the edge of Coalition space. The conversation, which was recorded and later became required viewing at several military academies, was brief. "Crystalline vessels. This is Admiral Chen of the Terran Defense Force. You are approaching Coalition space with weapons powered and shields raised. State your intentions." "Human Admiral, we are conducting a peaceful assessment of regional stability." "I see. Well, here's my assessment. The Coalition is under Terran protection. Any hostile action against Coalition worlds will be considered an act of war against humanity. I hope that clarifies the regional stability for you. You cannot threaten the crystalline choir. We have defended ourselves for millennia. I'm not threatening you. I'm educating you. There's a difference. You have 10 minutes to reverse course, or I'll provide a more hands-on lesson." The crystalline fleet departed within 5 minutes. But it wasn't just military protection that humans offered. They brought with them technologies and perspectives that revolutionized Coalition society. Human engineers designed more efficient FTL drives. Human farmers developed crops that could grow in previously uninhabitable environments. Human philosophers engaged in debates that expanded the Coalition's understanding of ethics and consciousness. Perhaps most importantly, they brought hope. Before humanity's arrival, the Coalition had been a loose alliance of peaceful species who lived in constant fear of more aggressive neighbors. Every few years, another threat would emerge: the hegemony, the void hunters, the Silicon Dominion, and the Coalition would huddle together, hoping someone else would solve their problems. Now, children on Coalition worlds grew up knowing that if danger came, Admiral Chen and her fleet would be there. It was a security that most species had never experienced. The change was perhaps most visible in the Coalition's youngest generation. Where once they had been raised to avoid conflict at all costs, now they learned both peace and strength. Human instructors taught them that there was no shame in fighting to protect what they loved. The first graduation ceremony of the Coalition Human Integration Academy became a galactic news event. Keth watched with tears in her eyes as young aquatics, florals, avians, and lithoids stood alongside human cadets, all of them sworn to protect the growing alliance. When a young floral named Petal approached the podium to give the valedictorian address, her words echoed across the sector. We were taught that peace meant avoiding conflict. Our human friends have shown us that real peace comes from being strong enough to protect it. The ceremony was interrupted by news of another crisis. The Void Hunters had emerged from dark space and were threatening the Outer Rim territories. It was the kind of threat that would have sent the old Coalition into panic. Admiral Chen simply stood up, straightened her uniform, and smiled. "Well," she said to Keth, "looks like it's time to introduce another species to human hospitality." As the combined Human Coalition fleet prepared for departure, Keth realized that something fundamental had changed in the galaxy. The age of peaceful species hiding from aggressive ones was over. The monsters from Sol had taught them that sometimes the only way to preserve peace was to be prepared for war. The Void Hunters were about to learn what the hegemony had discovered, that there were worse things in the galaxy than the monsters in the dark. There were the monsters who protected the light. Standing on the observation deck of Admiral Chen's flagship, watching the fleet jump to FTL, Keth smiled. 6 months ago, she had sent a desperate plea into the void, hoping someone would answer. She had gotten exactly what the Coalition needed. Not heroes, not saviors, but something better. They had gotten family. And humans, as the galaxy was learning, would move heaven and earth to protect their family. The last thing Keth heard before the ship entered hyperspace was Captain Rodriguez's voice over the communication system, addressing the Coalition crews serving alongside the humans. "Remember, folks, we're not going to war. We're going to remind some bullies why picking on our friends is a really bad idea. Let's go have some fun." As space blurred around them, Keth found herself laughing. Perhaps she was becoming more human than she realized. After all, she was rather looking forward to this fight herself.